So now that we got the basics of the Cinema 4D interface and the core concepts of creating parametric primitives, lighting, creating some really simple materials, and then previewing our scene, I want to do a real quick review in about 30 seconds or less to just review all the stuff that we talked about really quickly, and then push into building polygon objects or modifying parametric primitives into polygon objects, which will allow us to create more detail with our models. Now I'm just going to jump out of Cinema 4D real quick. I have my class folder. Inside my class folder, I'm going to create my project folder. I'm going to jump back into Cinema 4D, and it might seem a little silly to save my project even though I haven't done anything, but it's a really good practice to establish the location of the file. When you start making materials and references, there needs to be file association. So there's going to be links that are built between the material and the model. So I'm just going to go into the project folder, and I'll call this snowman01. Okay. Now, just a real quick review. I'm going to create a cube, and the cube is going to act as my floor for now, or just kind of a real simple ground plane. In the Y value, the Y size, I'm just going to take that way down, maybe something like 50, and maybe even less than that, maybe like 10 centimeters. I'm going to make the X and Z size, so I'm going to go in X space and Z, so that's the ground plane. I'll make that 2,000 centimeters. That might feel a little big. I'll probably change that in a bit, but I'll just zoom out just a little bit. At least that'll kind of give us an area to capture some shadows and give us a temporary environment. So the next thing I'm going to do is build the body really quickly. And so I'm going to create a sphere. Once I create that sphere, I want to move it up and just kind of restrict its motion to the y-axis. So I'm making sure that I roll over the y-axis. I'm also looking with this highlight, I want to make sure that the outside of the object is intersecting a little bit with the ground plane. You can see that that orange line, that orange highlight on the outside of the object is starting to disappear a little bit. So it's showing me that there's some overlap there. Now I'm going to jump into the object manager. I'm just going to name a few things really quickly. I'm going to call this floor for now. I'll get rid of the floor later in favor of a slightly more sophisticated environment landscape. But that bottom sphere, I'm just going to call that bottom. That's going to act as my snowman. Now I have a couple of choices here. I could just continue to create another sphere and then move that object up. That's one solution. I'm going to delete that. Alternatively, I could take the bottom sphere and Command C to copy, Command V to paste. That's Control V and Control C and Control V for you Windows folks out there. I'm going to rename this. I'll call that simply middle. And that's occupying the same position as the sphere that I copied. So I'll move that up a little bit, and I take the size down to about 70, maybe 75. Just kind of eyeballing that. I can change that a little bit later. I'll do the same thing, Command C, Command V. That gives me a duplicate, and I'll call this top. I'll move that up a little bit, and I'll take that down to say about 50. Okay. Now I'm pretty satisfied with the proportions right now of the snowman. I want to stick a few eyeballs on my snowman, so I'm going to create a new sphere. I'm going to take this size way down, maybe to 5 centimeters. I'll make it a little bit bigger later, but I'm going to lift it up, and I'm just kind of looking at the intersection of the axes to get a sense of where that is. Now remember, I've only been moving my content according to the y-axis at this point, and I can just select on each one of these objects and pay attention to the coordinates manager down here, and just look at the position of the object and make sure that up until now, all these objects are only moving along the y, so the y value is the only thing that's changing. This new sphere that I created, I'm going to call that I, and I've lifted it up so it's kind of in the center of the snowman head, and I'm just going to push that forward. Now the forward direction in Cinema 4D, again, is not arbitrary. It's in the direction that the z-axis of the world is pointing. Now, this object, because we haven't rotated it, its axes are pointing in the same direction as the world coordinate system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a short bit. But basically, if I want to get this eyeball in front of my snowman, I'm going to grab it by the z-axis and drag it away from the direction that the arrow is pointing. Okay, so kind of poke that through. I'm going to create really quick two materials. by double-clicking in the material palette here. I'll double-click on the material that I just created. The first one I'm going to call iMat. So iMaterial. I'm going to go into the color swatch. I'm just going to darken that up quite a bit, make it kind of a charcoal. And I can change this later. I'll leave the reflectance on this time around, but I'll drag and drop. Now this is the case where I could drag and drop the material onto an object, but that could be a hard object, especially if there's a lot of models around, to isolate that with the drag and drop of the material. So what I'm going to do is just drag and drop it into the object manager. There's a couple of benefits of that. I can be a little bit more precise. As you'll see when we start parenting and grouping objects, we can apply one texture to an entire group. And this is the best way to manage that. So I have my eye, and I've kind of pushed it forward. Now I'm going to zoom in by tapping the F key, F to frame, S for selected. I was thinking of a different application. So that's right in the center, kind of more in the position of where the nose should be. And I'm just gonna eyeball this. Yep, I said that. I'm gonna move that up. Okay, and I can see it's kind of floating away from the face. That's okay. I'll fix that in a minute. I'm gonna move it to the left. Okay, so I moved it up along the y-axis. I moved it forward in the z-axis. Okay, the forward direction in this case, we're moving into the negative as we move closer to the camera. And I moved it to the left on the x-axis at roughly 16 and some change. And I'm just going to round that value off and hit return. The reason I'm going to do that is because I'll copy and paste this eye, and I'll just move it over on the x to positive 16. Okay, so now I have two eyes. They're kind of both floating out in space, and this is a good time to talk a little bit about object grouping or parenting objects. So the way that object groups work in 3D typically are that we can select two objects, and I'm just shift clicking. So I have one object selected. I'll hold down the shift key and click on the second object. Alternatively, what I can do is I can click and drag inside the object manager and make sure that that marquee, all the objects I want to select fall within that marquee. Now the only tricky thing about that is it's easy to select stuff that you don't want, so you got to be careful. So I'm just going to shift click. I have both eyes selected, and I want to group these together. And the way I'll do that is I'll go to Object, and in this Object drop-down menu, I want to choose Group Object. Okay. Now what happens is that creates an empty 3D object. It's called a null. A null object is just a position in space. It's an object that doesn't have any geometry associated with it. And once I group that, you can see that I get this little plus sign next to it. And if I click on the plus sign, it'll show me the hierarchical view of that relationship. Currently, the null is the parent object. And the children of the parent object is I1 and I2, or just I1 and I. Okay, so we have a parent-child relationship, and the idea with a parent-child relationship is that I can select the parent, in this case the null, and I can move that, and both those objects will move together. In addition to that, it has its own coordinate system, or not its own coordinate system, but the center by default of these two objects is the center position of the parent object. Okay, so I'm going to rename this null. I'll call this eyes plural, okay, because I know that they're both in there, and I'll just drag that back into space. Now, one of the benefits of grouping objects and having this parent-child relationship, there's a number of advantages. One of them is that even though this is a group, I can just go into an object group, select one of the children, and I can still move those independently. Okay, so it's still part of a group, but because I have the individual object selected, I can move that around. I'll Command Z to undo, and I'll select the eyes. Now the other thing that I could do is I'm going to get rid of the material on I1 and I, and I'll just select that material tag and hit delete. I'll select the material tag and hit delete. If I take a material and I drag and drop that onto the eyes parent object, you can see that all the children inherit that material. Now we can manually override, so if we have 10 objects and we want all 10 of those objects to have one material, we can drag that onto the parent, but then if we want to have just one of those materials a different color, we can drag a new material onto it. And to demonstrate that, I'm going to just temporarily create a snow material. So I'll call this snow mat. And I'm going to create a white texture. I'm going to send it towards blue a little bit, just to get a hint of blue in here. I'll be a little heavy-handed with the color, just so we can see this a little bit more clearly. I'm going to turn the reflectance off for now. I'll come back in later and modify some of those settings. But I'm going to close the material editor, and now, so remember, on the parent object that I called eyes, and let me rename these eyes. I'm going to call this left eye. Okay, it's on the right side of my screen, but it's the snowman's left eye. Okay, so I'll leave that up to you as to whether you want to use the first person relationship or the view that you're looking in. But just like there's a front side of an object in Cinema 4D, and it's not arbitrary, same thing with right and left, and so I'll just call this right eye and hit return. Now, so I want to get in the habit of naming things, managing things in the object manager appropriately. But just a reminder, the parent object has the material, and I'm going to take this snow material that I just made, and I'm going to drop it on the right eye. And now you can see that this object, the right eye, has its own material. So the parent has a material, and that's being applied to everything, but because I applied a material to the right eye, it has priority. Okay, so I'll just select that material tag in the object manager and hit the delete key again, and that will get rid of that material. So I'm going to do the same thing for the snowman body. Now, rather than selecting and shift clicking, so I'm just shift clicking to select, and I could, if I hold down the shift key and I select an entire range, you can see it selects that entire line of objects. If I want to individually add objects to a selection, what I'll do is I'll just select the object I want, and on a Mac I'll hold down the command key, and that allows me just to kind of go through and individually pick objects that I want to add to the selection. That should be the control key for Windows folks. I'm going to hold down the command key and select all three of these. So I have three different methods of very easily selecting objects through the object manager. The first is I can click and drag, okay, and I was very precise about the way that I clicked there. I just put my mouse in between these tags and this little layer icon. We'll talk about that later. And the objects, I'm just going in this negative space here and I'm clicking. That creates a marquee, and that way I'm just selecting those three objects. Now, at this point I could go to object group, just like I did before. All right, I could use Option G to group. Now that's Option on the keyboard, not Command G, Option G. I believe it's Alt G on a PC, but at this point you'll have to start playing with those keys if you're using a PC. I'll Command Z and undo that. And so you'll notice what happened when I selected these objects and I chose Command G. It put those objects in a null or in a parent object. Okay, I'll Command Z to undo that. So I can click and drag to select. I can select the first object and hold down Shift and select a range of objects. And that's useful if I want everything from point A to point B selected. Now if I want individual objects, what I'll do is I'll just select one and then hold down the Command key. Okay, so I have those selected. I'll Command G to group, or I have another option. If I go over here into the parametric primitives, or the place where I generate my geometry, you may have noticed that if I click and hold, the first object is a null object. So I'm going to create a null object. At the top of my object manager is this null, and I have it selected. Now, I don't see the axes right now. It's because it's in the center of my world space down here. But I'll just take that null and I'll move it up, and you'll see that this null object, again, it only has a position coordinate associated with it. Okay, it's nothing else. It's an empty 3D object, or a null object. And this can receive other objects, and we can group things by taking a null, or it doesn't even have to be a null, it could be another piece of geometry, and we can take objects and drag and drop. Now when I drag in the object manager, you'll notice that my cursor, next to my cursor there's an arrow, and it might be pointing left or it might be pointing down. If it's pointing left, that means that it's in the root of the object manager. Okay, but if I roll over the null object at the top, you can see there's a down arrow. That means I'll be placing this object that I'm dragging and dropping into that null object. I'll do the same thing with middle and bottom. I'll select both of them and drag them up and drop them. So now I have top, middle, excuse me, middle, bottom, top. That seems like a strange arrangement of content. I like it arranged hierarchically, so if there's something on top, I want that to be at the top of the list. And all I need to do is drag in this case. Now you'll notice that arrow's flipping around because I could, keep nesting this object in other stuff. But what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that arrow is pointed to the left, but I'm underneath null, and I'll just release it and rearrange that, that content. So I'll rename this null. I'll call this snowman body for now. It might just end up being my snowman. Now, the snowman body, because I created a null and I moved it into a funny position, you can see that, remember I placed the null up here, so I placed it in a strange position. So now that snowman's center point, or its axis, is floating over its head, which is kind of a strange thing. Okay, let me show you the alternative. If I pull these objects out, so I'm going to select the children, and I'll drag, and I'm looking for the left arrow, but I want to be above that object or somewhere in the root of the object manager. I've dragged those out. I'm going to select the snowman body, and I'm going to hit delete. Remember, that was just a null object, so I'll try this technique again, but rather than generating a null object this way, that shows up at the center of the world space, when I'll delete that object. If I have objects selected and I choose object group or option G, it'll figure out the average, it'll find the center of all three of those objects and place that there. So, different applications for different reasons. Typically what I like to do is just select the objects I want to group and group them. I'll call this snowman body. And now you'll notice that when we move the snowman around, if I want to lift the snowman up or move him around or animate him or do something, I'll Command Z. His center point is going to be right in the center of his body, which could be kind of strange because I really want this object to kind of register with the bottom of the snowman or move kind of closer to the ground. So if it tips over, I could use a rotation to rotate this guy. And just to demonstrate, if I grab the rotation tool and I just kind of rotate, you can see that it rotates around its axis. Okay, Command Z. So a couple of things to look forward to in the future is just being mindful of where the axis of your object is and how it's going to move and animate accordingly. Okay, so more about that axis a little bit later. So I have eyes and I have a snowman body. They're two separate parent objects. I'm going to take the eyes and drop those into the snowman body. Now, I'm not going to really do anything else with the eyes. Maybe later I'll change the size of them, maybe the material, but for now I can kind of ignore them, so I'm going to collapse the eyes menu. Okay? So I have the basic nuts and bolts of grouping objects. I'll throw a few lights in the scene with that same basic strategy that we talked about in the previous presentation, which is I'll just make a key light, and I'll send that kind of in front of, but off to the left of the snowman, or his right side, her right side, whichever. So I have a key light, and I'll turn shadows on, and I'll just use Shadow Map Soft. I'm going to create another light, and this will be my fill light. I'll move that up and into the foreground a little bit, and I'm going to take the intensity of that way down. Now these are just a real simple light setup. I'll add some detail to those later, but I'll give this a quick preview render. So I have the 3 render buttons up here. If I go to the first button on the left, that's render preview, and you can see that I'm getting my render. Now I'll click in the workspace, I'll select my first light that I created. I'm going to rename this key light, and so I just want to stay organized and kind of start naming things appropriately. So I'll do one more test render by using Command R. Excuse me, and that gets us right about back to where we were in the previous presentation with the addition of object groups. So I'm going to do a quick file save, make sure that I save my progress, and I'll do a file save incremental so that as I move forward with this object or with this model, I can be fairly bold about some of the design decisions that I'm making. So in the next presentation, we'll talk about polygon modeling and modifying objects based on their component parts, but we'll do that in the next presentation.